Hello and welcome to In Conservation with. I'm David Lindo, also known as the Urban Birder. And for those unfamiliar with In Conservation with, it's a series of Zoom interviews. It's not really a podcast. People have often asked me, "What is this?" And I'm saying, I don't know. It's a bunch of conversations I've had over the last 4 years, coming up to 5 years next year, with movers and shakers around the world, of within the world even, and around the world, of conservation. And today, I'm really happy to introduce to you a young lady I met. I think I met you this year, actually. Did I? Maybe I met you before, but Emily Engle. Very pleased to have you here. And please, how are you and where are you?
Hi, David. Well, I am so delighted to be here. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited to chat a little bit more about Merlin and eBird today. And I am actually talking to you from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology here in Ithaca, New York. I'm sitting at my desk, and as we chatted about briefly earlier, I'm surrounded by some beautiful photos behind me here in the Macaulay Library.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I've been to your building a couple of times and I was knocked out by the art on the walls and the history and knowing that so many things have happened in that building. And I'm also delighted that in my career as the urban birder, I've basically been working with the Cornell laboratory in some way for nearly all that time. So it's really fantastic. You are the outreach coordinator, aren't you? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's a very broad title, but as the outreach coordinator for eBird and Merlin, I'm really lucky to have the opportunity to communicate with people both digitally and in person. On the eBird side of things, that means that I get to send out a lot of emails. So if you're getting updates on the stats that you've contributed, I get to help put those together. And create other content that will kind of inform folks about how their birding journeys are going. And of course, one of the highlights is getting to come and chat with folks like yourself and everyone that's using the eBird and Merlin platforms to make them better and support this broad birding community.
Okay, what were you doing before eBird? I mean, have you always been interested in natural history?
Yes, I have always been interested in natural history. So before I came to the Cornell lab, I guess we can go back quite a few years here. I grew up on the California coast, and so I developed a really deep love for the natural world. I think that spawned starting in tide pools, poking through, looking for invertebrates. And eventually, after I went off to school, I majored in environmental studies and was really interested in learning how to help connect people in the natural world and how do we help work together to actually conserve what we have in nature. And
Hmm.
so from there, I ended up taking a position as a natural interpreter on Little St. Simon's Island in Georgia, and then moved into an outreach role there and eventually found my way up here to Ithaca.
Ithaca at this time of year, for those who don't know, it's in the New York State. And I remember when I first showed up, and I drove from, I landed in Newark Airport, and I thought, oh, I'll just jump in the car, be 5 minutes to get to Ithaca. 5 hours later, I'm in Ithaca. Maybe took a couple of wrong turns on the way, but 5 hours later, it made me realize just how massive the United States is. And during the winter, it's absolutely bone-chillingly cold. I mean, what's it like in the moment?
It's a little brisk. We definitely had snow on the ground, and this environment has been very new for myself after being in California and then Georgia. Coming up here and having snow and freezing temperatures on a regular basis through the winter has been an entirely new experience. But that said, we do get a lot of benefits that come with it. There's a lot
Okay.
of ducks in the area right now, which is always exciting. So if you stay warm enough, Ithaca is a delightful experience.
And also, you got the woods around the actual uh, where your base is, your buildings. Is that a nature reserve or is that somewhere that only your staff enjoys?
Yeah, so this is a piece of land called Sapsucker Woods, and it's where the Cornell lab is actually set on. So members of the public are welcome to come and explore Sapsucker Woods. And then I have to say, if you're gonna venture up here, you should definitely make a stop at the Cornell Lab Visitor Center. They just reopened this year, and that's been an incredible um, space to learn about birds. There's events that can occur there, as well as this new Discovery Center and theater that shows all of these wonderful films from the conservation media team, and then highlights several murals that are gorgeous to look at as well, all celebrating the natural history of birds.
Yeah, fantastic. One thing I forgot to do actually is to thank our sponsors for In Conservation Move. They are Cower Sporting Optics, who are the manufacturer of the world renowned Promenade series of spotting scopes, and also for birds, wildlife, and nature, the tour company that strives to deliver the best in birding and wildlife watching opportunities throughout the world. So thank you very much, guys, for supporting us. You know what? I think maybe let's have a look at what eBird and Merlin is all about, because I think people. It's amazing how it's become part of everyone's life almost. For me, eBird especially was something that was American or from the Americas. But now I've noticed, I'm based in Spain, so I see we operate our lives using eBird. It's become this sort of second string to whatever we do. So it'd be interesting to get the official kind of you know description of what you guys do, and and then we can have a chat about how that relates to life, really.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. How eBird and Merlin relate to life. So I did put a few slides together, which I'm happy to share now. And we can kind of hop through some of the new things that have come up in the Merlin app and touch on what eBird is and all that it brings to that space as well.
Yeah, that'd be good. And of course, those watching live, if you want to watch it in full glory, put yourself on viewer or speaker view. And if you're watching this in the future, like and subscribe, tell all your friends, tell some of your enemies how great in conservation with is, and check out some of the older conversations that I've had on my YouTube channel, which is the Urban Birder the Urban Birder World, I think it is. Yeah, I can't remember what it's called actually, but you'll find it anyway. Anyway, over to you, Emily.
Thank you. Well, on that note of some past conversations you've had, it's my understanding that you and Chris Wood checked in as well. Um, for those of you that are familiar, Chris Wood works here at eBird, and he's actually my boss, but he said to pass along a huge hug to you, David, and send his greetings.
Back at him, and you could take some for yourself as well.
Well, thank you. So, yeah, today we're going to talk a little bit about Merlin. And Merlin is a bird identification app that was produced here at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And it is centered on showing people the wonders of birds and helping them ID birds through photo ID, sound ID, or through a step-by-step identification process. And so it's really one of the first steps that people can take as they learn about birds and they learn to love birds. Now, eBird is a participatory science project also produced here at the Cornell Lab. And rather than just teaching about birds, it's actually a platform where users can record what they're seeing to produce data that's then used to inform conservation action and policy, while simultaneously providing that data for other birders to inform their birding practices. And so all of these platforms really work together in that that data that's being recorded in eBird can help inform the species that people are being presented in Merlin. So it can help hone the identifications that the Merlin platform is keying in on. And in turn, Merlin is helping to train people and teach people about the birds that they'll be reporting in eBird. So they work really closely together, and all of our teams here at the lab follow suit. Now, I wanted to throw together just some fun numbers. I think whenever I look at how much Merlin has grown, it can be really exciting to stare at kind of the breakdown of what all these people actually look like. So there's just in the last month, there's been over 2.9 million active users on the Merlin app. Sound ID itself, so identifying birds by the noises that they're producing, has been used over 1.5 billion times. And then a tremendous number of birds have been detected with Sound ID in this past year. So those numbers, I think, speak to the interest in birding and the number of folks that are either familiar with birds and already using Merlin to help them detect them, or the number of new birders that are actually joining our global birding community, which is really exciting to think about. So a lot of folks that do use Merlin are probably familiar with this screen. This is our Sound ID function that's built into the app, and it allows you to record birds. And then based on those birds' sounds, the app produces a spectrogram or a visual representation of sound. From there, the app is able to select the species whose spectrograms meet that and present them to you. So many folks have been using this, and that's kind of how the app gained a lot of popularity. But in the last year, Merlin has introduced a ton of really exciting new features. So many of you might have already seen the bird of the day that is showing up on your Merlin home screen, the new sharing function that's allowing you to share media or the birds that you're seeing. And then, of course, just this last month, we released our brand new photo ID model, which has been a really tremendous accomplishment for many members of the team here. So for folks that use the bird of the day function, this is a bird that is presented to you. It is one of the species most likely to occur around you, and it randomly is shown on your screen. You get one per day, and you have the opportunity to find that, see if you can record that in your app. And then now, with the new sharing function, you're actually able to share with your friends and your birding besties if you've found your bird of the day or if there's a new species that you've detected near you. So it's been really cool to kind of see how people have used these new features to further themselves on their birding journeys and to engage friends, families, and other birders in their adventures in the outdoors. And lastly, I kind of put a few more slides together on the new photo ID function. So last month, we updated the model that's used in Merlin to identify species birds based on their photos. And Merlin is using machine learning to take photos of birds that folks like you and I capture, use location and time data to then produce a list of species that that photo is most likely of. But this model wasn't created just by one person. It's taken a lot of work and a lot of data in the form of photos to actually inform. So the Macaulay Library is another valuable piece of the puzzle when it comes to eBird and Merlin. For those of you that use eBird, you probably know if you're uploading sound recordings or photos, those pieces of media from your eBird checklists are actually uploaded to the Macaulay Library. And so now the Macaulay Library is home to over 67 million images. And all of those images have been used to train Merlin. And to give you an idea, if you were to line up, if you were to print every single photo of those out and line them up side by side, I think it would stretch all the way from me here in Sapsucker Woods to you, David, in Spain and back again. So it's just a huge quantity of photos that have gone into this. And that's all in thanks to folks um, like you, like birders around the world that have contributed images on their eBird checklist that have been then added to the Macaulay Library. Now, although it's really valuable to look at how broadly these photos are coming in from, how much coverage around the world the images in Macaulay Library do represent, there's about 100 countries that represent 25% of the photos in the Macaulay Library. And so there's still a lot of opportunities to gain photos from other parts of the world. And the same thing goes with species. Although we love cardinal photos and our red-tailed hawks, there's about 200 species that represent about 50% of all the images in Macaulay Library. And so we're always so excited to welcome new contributions of species and locations around the world to make the learning tools in Merlin better. Now, when training the model that went into Merlin, there can be issues when there were tons of species that were represented in each of the photos. And that made it really tricky for the model to actually detect which species was going to be utilized. So they decided they would take photos that just had one particular species. And so to do this, they would detect the number of different birds in an image and then classify that single species. So on our photo on the left, we have a great example of a bird that the model is easily able to identify. It can see that there's only one individual in there, while the bird, the water thrush, on the right actually isn't quite accurate. We know that there's two images in there, or two species in there, and that the prothonotary warbler is in fact one of them. So the model declaring that this is a water thrush wouldn't be entirely accurate. So really, there were a lot of little tips and tricks along the way that went into making this new photo model successful. And so it took a lot of iterations to make everything work just right. Now, we can also touch a little further on this model if that's helpful to learn more about background that went into photo ID. Or I'm not sure if we have any questions on any of the.
Well, what we'll do is, if you could just carry on, and we'll do the Q&A at the end. It's quite interesting to delve a bit more into, this whole thing, and then we can answer questions afterwards.
Awesome. Okay. Excellent. So the model works really well now, even in pretty challenging circumstances. So from these three examples, you can see the model is able to detect a bird in the image, even when at first glance, I know myself, I would struggle to find a bird in the third photo. If anyone else is able to identify that bird immediately, kudos to you. You have a great eye. But again, as the model used in Photo ID was being tested, there appeared to be a bit of a data imbalance. Going back to that those same kind of initial hiccups, about 54 of the images that were being used to train the model were from the US, and 1.5% of the images that were used in that training set were images of great blue herons or red-tailed hawks. So these are common species. They look great in photographs. Of course, they would represent a lot of the photos in the archive and in this training set. But we know that's not representative of the broader um, collection of species that occur around the world. So that's when the that's when Merlin or the model in Merlin decided to randomly sample photos. So instead of just picking several random photos, those images um, or locations were used to cluster and select a random sampling of images using both location and time as clustering dimensions. And so to improve then the selected set of images, we wanted to maximize diversity. We wanted to prioritize certain images being included, whether that was particular behaviors or particular um, actions that birds were taking that were noted down. And so multiple iterations were then taken to select kind of these highest priority images. But there were still some challenges that occurred with those. So the number of images that were occurring near a cluster um, affected the algorithms. Vagrants played a big role in that. So if you want to maximize the amount of spatial diversity that's occurring within a model, it means vagrants are often prioritized. This Nutting's flycatcher, which was photographed in Arizona, is one of those vagrants. So a lot of folks go out and take photos of this species that they wouldn't normally get to see. And that can be challenging for multiple reasons. One, because you can actually see that this particular bird has a little deformity in its bill, and that's something that the model would easily hone in on. So to train the model, essentially, they want to minimize the amount of loss that is occurring. So you want to maximize the amount of times that the model is getting a species identification correct. So back in this example, some steps were taken to minimize the number of vagrants that were then included. In that training model, then, they're able to go through and calculate the amount of loss that's occurred. Calculate the loss that's occurred based on each image it's shown. And then this process is repeated. So Photo ID was trained on over 2,000 images in each batch. And so each model, or the model was shown each image about 200 times. And in order to keep the model from memorizing each individual image that it's seeing and just showing the same result over and over, there were a few tricks that the team integrated to keep it from memorizing each image. So that process took about 8 days to train the model on. And so then they get to go through and evaluate how successful Merlin is, or that model is. So they use the test set and try to make sure that the model is extremely accurate. And to do that, the model, we're assessing if the photo identification agrees with the uploader's identification or how they've uploaded that species to Macaulay. Additionally, this is where eBird comes in again. So we know that based on where a user is, um, there's a certain number of species that are more likely to occur there. And so Merlin takes input from eBird. So what are eBirders reporting on checklists? What are they likely to see? And is then able to filter the results that the model is producing with species likely to be occurring in that location during that time. And this is another way, if you are using Merlin, to make sure the results that you're seeing are more accurate. So a lot of times when you first download Merlin or first open Merlin, you'll see a request to access location services, and we always encourage users to allow that to maximize the accuracy of your results. So after we've ran through the training set, we've integrated those controls based on location and time of year. The model has a high degree of accuracy. But that doesn't mean that it's always perfect, and that definitely means that there's lots of opportunities for growth. So, as we touched on earlier, there's a lot of places in the world that don't have a ton of photo representation in the Macaulay Library. And there's also a lot of species around the world that don't have a vast amount of representation in the Macaulay Library. So adding more images will help increase the accuracy of this data. So to all birders around the world that are capturing photos and uploading them to eBird checklists, you can help with that process. So about 40,000 images per day are uploaded to ML. And that's a huge number. Each one of those contributions can be helpful in bettering the tools within Merlin. And the entire review process that goes into actually identifying the species in images is all manual. So anyone that can help with that process is always welcome. But overall, Merlin has kind of revolutionized how a lot of people go birding. And the tools that are within Merlin are also always adapting and changing. And so I think that's one of the reasons why this photo ID update has been so exciting. The last photo update was in 2019. And since then, millions of images have been added to the Macaulay Library. And through those additional assets and through updates in the machine learning model that is actually in Merlin, we've seen a substantial improvement and increase in the accuracy of these tools. And we've now seen more people than ever getting out and going birding, whether that's their first time or whether that's their millionth time. So it's always really exciting when we get to reflect on some of these new advancements. And the same thing goes for the new Sound ID model that was released earlier this year. At the end of last year, we celebrated nearly 2 million sound recordings being added to the Macaulay Library. And as we start to close out 2024, we just saw that we've broken 2.5 million sound recordings being added in ML. And so because of the contributions of birders around the world through eBird, we're actually seeing tremendous leaps and bounds that are occurring in our ability to identify species and provide tools to other birders. So with that, I'm excited to answer any questions that you might have about Merlin, the new tools that have come out in it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Emily. I mean, we're gonna you and I will, as I say, we're going to have a chat first, and then there's a Q and A afterwards. And again, those watching in the future and wondering, when, how can I see the Q&A? Q&A, it must be amazing. Become a member of the Urban Birder World community. Go to urbanbirderworld.com and check it out. Really fascinating, actually. And some lovely pictures. I love that buff breasted sandpiper at the end. Beautiful. I noticed actually, just a little point, the bay-breasted warbler um, um, picture, or the image you put up, the map, also had one little dot in Wales. I noticed.
Oh,
Was
well,
that, was that deliberate, or was that an accident, or was that actually because it turned up as a vagrant or something?
I will have to look back and see if there are any vagrants in Wales, but that is an awesome detail you spotted.
Well, we're birders. That's what we do, isn't it? We look for
Mhm.
details. You know, with Merlin, I mean, look, Merlin has become this thing that I go out birding and people are saying to me, "Oh, do you know about this new app? You know, you can recognize birdsong." Because basically, for me anyway, I've always associated Merlin with sound as opposed to images. I know you got your new photo ID feature. I've never ever used it. I don't even know how to use it actually. In the field, how do, practically, how do you use a photo ID feature?
Yeah. Well, and I think people use it in many different ways, whether that's a photo that they had from 10 years ago that they upload um, by selecting a photo from their library and then ID from there in the field. If you're digiscoping, you can do the little alignment holding your phone up to your scope or your binoculars to snag a photo of any bird. And then the Merlin will actually go through and then list the likely species that are occurring based on the date and time location that you've entered with that photo. And so it can be a little bit of a tricky process if you are attempting to identify birds real time. Um, but it's definitely doable if you pull your phone out, snag a photo, and the model is extremely accurate. Even with fuzzy photos, it's still able to go through and give you a suggestion of species.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've been noticing, as I say, I've never used the photo ID feature, but I have noticed on some of the Facebook pages that talk about ID, um, it says Merlin said this, but can you tell me if it is that? And most of the time, I've noticed Merlin was right. There was one occasion when it was completely wrong, but as you say, as with anything, even humans, we get it wrong occasionally. Which brings me on to the idea about the actual images of themselves. I know you said that they're manually checked. How does that actually work? Because there's often times when you take pictures of things and you either categorize them, or you just don't know what they are. Who checks them exactly? How are they checked?
That's a great question. So, who actually goes through and annotates these images that are used to train the Merlin model? So we have a team of thousands of annotators that have volunteered around the world that have gone through and identified birds in images by selecting and dragging a box around that specific individual in an image. And so it's an extremely manual process that has taken countless hours to accomplish. And it's then those images that have a bird that has been identified and selected that can be added to the model and used to train it.
So,
So it,
so go on.
so I was just going to note, even though it kind of seems like this magic of technology, in many ways it is, but it's all in thanks to a lot of manual love that has gone into it.
So in theory, the Cornell laboratory could effectively put out a field guide to the birds of the world or birds of particular areas with images perhaps of all different plumages, because obviously you're going to get people sending pictures, you know, that are not necessarily the classic summer plumage or winter plumage. Would that is that a possibility, or is that something that you never really kind of considered?
I think that that's a really interesting idea, to put out packs that are kind of specific around different plumages. That would be really exciting to see. I know that with this model, there has been a lot of effort to selecting birds that are enacting particular behaviors. So whether that's um, a bird that's in a slightly different position than you would normally see, the model has been equipped to help identify those.
So, as I said before, I don't use a photo ID feature, never have. I've always looked at Merlin as being something to do with sound and identifying calls. And, I heard of Merlin, I guess, when you first launched it, whenever that was. And at the time, I thought, oh, this is just America centric. I can't see anyone using it in Europe or anywhere else. But obviously, with the machine learning and all that sort of stuff, it's now become a major thing. And I know there's been a few other apps out there that are kind of intuitive in terms of like being a Shazam for bird calls, but obviously Merlin walks away with that particular crown. What kind of people actually do use Merlin? Um, I asked that question. It may be a very obvious one, but yeah, what kind of people do you think actually? Have you got research on who actually, what kind of person uses Merlin for the sounds, listen to bird calls?
Hmm, That's a really interesting question. Do you is do you mean are they using it in a particular way or
The question I'm asking is about, I guess it's a marketing question. Or even, are these people experts? Are they beginners? What exactly are they looking to do with Merlin? Because, I mean, I asked that question because I use Merlin occasionally. I used it today when I was out birding because I heard something I wasn't sure about, and I tried to listen to it with Merlin, and Merlin didn't actually know what it was, didn't answer. So I use it to enhance my birding in that if I hear a strange call, Merlin says it's something, I'll think, oh, that's interesting. I'll go and see if I can find it.
Mhm.
But I've seen other people use Merlin, like it's the gospel. They don't even bother looking. It's like, oh, there's this around, there's that around. And I think, I'm interested to see how you or what sort of person you think uses it and how they should use it. I've had situations, and I know other people have, when you're leading tours and someone's walking around with Merlin on, which kind of makes you think, well, why are you with me then, kind of thing. So I just want to understand if you actually understand as a entity what sort of person uses your app, your Merlin app.
Yeah. Well, I think the short answer is all of the above. But in a little bit of a broader context, we have seen almost everybody across the board using Merlin. I mean, whether that's from very experienced birders who have been birding for years and they just want to supplement what they're hearing and see what the app says, they'll pull Merlin out on an excursion. We've also seen a lot of folks who have experienced hearing loss and just want to be able to detect birds that they're no longer able to detect by ear. Even on the other side of things, we know it's great for folks that have just started to become interested in birds. They want to hear what's calling around their house. Um, I think it's been really wonderful on social media to actually see all the ways that people are using Sound ID, whether that's on the back porch with their cup of coffee, or students that are using Merlin just as a fun way to get outside and interact with nature. We've even met folks that have shared with us that their favorite thing to do when they put makeup on in the morning is to lean photo on ID on their windowsill and identify the species that are calling around them. So it's really this. broad range of people that are engaging with Merlin. And I think that that's very exciting as well because it means that a lot of people that might not have otherwise gotten to experience birds or learn about birds are now interacting with them in some way, whether that is putting mascara on in the morning or whether they've been birding for 30 years. So it's really a whole span of people.
And are most of those people that use Merlin based in the Americas or based in North America, or how's it penetrating the rest of the world, Europe in particular?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of growth in Europe, which is really exciting. The springtime is always when we see the highest usage of Merlin across the board. So it's very well established here in the US, but there's been significant growth in Europe, particularly this past spring. But we're also seeing Merlin being used more broadly across the world. Um, Now, Sound ID is the most used feature, and it has very comprehensive coverage of all of the species in North America, as well as the species in Europe. But there's still a lot of room for increases in species coverage um, in South America, Africa, and India and Asia. But the vast, many of the most common species in South America are included in that Sound ID model. And so as more sound recordings are added to the Macaulay library, there will then be increases in the amount of species that are included in the Sound ID model, which will be really beneficial to expand its adoption more broadly.
Okay, and what's next in the progress of the Merlin app? Well, what do you call it, by the way? You just call it Merlin.
Yeah, people call it Merlin, the Merlin Bird ID app. Um, a lot of people have just been referring to it as Merlin more broadly. But there's lots of room to grow. I think Merlin is looking really to make sure that the features that are already included in the app are able to support as many people as possible. So looking at expanding the number of species included in both photo ID and sound ID is going to be of utmost importance. And just to give folks an idea of how much effort that can take, for each species that's added to Sound ID, we need at least 100 annotated recordings from the Macaulay library that are used to train the Sound ID model that are added to Merlin. And so that's a tremendous amount of work. So it will likely be a fairly long process that goes into expanding the coverage of those functions, but it's one that we feel will really be worthwhile.
It must have cost a bucket load of money to organize this, to develop this. So how does it pay for itself?
That's a great question as well. We're often asked, how can Merlin be a free resource for birders? And more broadly, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is a member-supported organization. So thanks to members of the Cornell Lab, um, they've supported a multitude of projects that have come out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And we are one of the beneficiaries of those, um, along with many donors that have really believed in the mission of Merlin and supported its growth and progress along the way.
Okay. Let's switch to eBird. I guess the sister. Would you call it a sister to Merlin, or
Honors,
is eBird the daddy, the mummy and daddy?
we refer to them as birding besties.
Okay. Oh, eBird. I mean, this is a very interesting phenomenon because again, when I first heard of eBird, I thought it was just all about America or North America. And I know that in Britain, most of us birders I say at the time, maybe 99% were using other apps, like, for example, Bird Track. And I remember speaking to your boss, Chris Wood, and complaining because I felt that eBird was too American centric. I felt that when it dealt with birds from Europe, they had strange names, and I even got annoyed with the spelling of grey when it came to grey heron. You know, Gray, so Grey, little things like that. But then he showed me that if I just clicked a button, then it will make it all, you know, Europe centric, which then made me really like eBird and start using it a lot. But I think that may not necessarily have translated to a lot of other people. I don't know how. What's again? Do you know what the penetration of eBird is in places like Britain? Because I know, for example, in Europe, it's been broadly taken on. In Spain, it's, you know, everyone's using eBird. But when I go back to Britain, where I guess, you know, many, in terms of, like, you know, per capita, most people are, you know, there's more people birding than in the most other places in the world. I find very few people actually that indulge in eBird, and it's kind of interesting because I go somewhere in Britain, I'm putting stuff in eBird, and I'm looking, I'm thinking, what, house sparrow undiscovered or unknown in this area? Come on, you know, because obviously no one's been doing stuff. Have you found that there's been a resistance, if that's the right word, to eBird in places like Britain? And what are you doing, if anything, to actually try and address that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really valuable to acknowledge that bird track is widely used across Britain, and it's a really great resource for birders. eBird has been broadly adopted because it does have really a global application. And so I wouldn't say that there's resistance to adoption so much as eBird is another resource that's available, but BirdTrack is already collecting lots of valuable data, similar to data that eBird is collecting in different regions, that is all going to help inform conservation.
Okay. How does eBird actually work? I know that eBird, obviously, I know that eBird is a scientific tool, I suppose, citizen science tool, and I've seen the heat maps and what have you of species on a given day, you know, being reported on eBird, and it's really amazing stuff. But how does it work on a local level? Just can you explain that? Because I think of eBird. I mean, I obviously know more because I'm in it and I talk to people like you all day long. But most people using eBird do not have the opportunity to talk to you, for example. So you kind of think that eBird is this thing whereby you give you information and it goes to Ithaca, it goes to the Cornell laboratory, but there's no steps in between. And in other words, it feels like it's unfiltered. But how does it work? When you are in your local area outside of the US, for example, because I am, when you make your selection of what you've seen on that day, what happens once you press submit?
Yeah, I like that idea that it just zooms off to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. But in actuality, when an eBirder submits an eBird checklist, um, oftentimes that data can go through a review process. So if you identify on your checklist that you have documented a species that is rare for your area during a certain time or in that particular location, then there's a review process that occurs when a regional reviewer, of which there's thousands of eBird reviewers around the world, each with um, a deep understanding and knowledge of the species of particular regions, will go through and review your sighting. Sometimes they might ask for media to just confirm the identification of the species that you've submitted. Um, and that is playing a major role in the accuracy of data that's reported. So if that occurs and some rare species are um, documented, then the reviewer will confirm that sighting, and that then comes into a broader pool of data. That data from eBird is used to update stats on the eBird platform. So if you're in a particular region, you are looking to go bird in some new places, you can then see those stats if they've been shared publicly for different hotspots or specific locations. Um, on the flip side of that, so instead of just data being used for birders, that data can then be contributed to um, potentially be used in status and trends products that are produced by eBird. And those document species and the increases or declines in their population. And that can be then used to inform management and potentially even policy decisions surrounding birds more broadly.
Okay, so basically there are people who adjudicate. Once you've sent your record, there's a local kind of adjudicators who will ask questions if there is something that is a bit of an anomaly or something a bit strange or unusual. They'll ask questions. Is that something that happens voluntarily in that people have done this on their own accord, or is this something that you how does it work? Do you actually from Ithaca say to everyone around the world, or you go to different bird clubs or I don't know, bird life organizations and say, look, we need to set this up? How does it work? Or do people just do it off their own accord? Which means, are there areas in the world where that doesn't happen and people can just put whatever they want and it's not really checked?
Mm. Well, the reviewer process is very much coordinated. So for each region, we do have a volunteer reviewer, and they review all of the checklists that come in for that specific region. They don't just pick and choose a random checklist to look at. Um, the species that come in as flagged or as a rare, unlikely species occur based on numbers that have been set for their particular region. So, just like up here in Ithaca, we would not expect to see a painted bunting right now. So, any painted bunting that appears on a checklist would automatically say, oops, there's a species that looks really unique for this time, and that's going to be flagged and go to a reviewer. So, it's a technical process in the first one, but then it relies on that human input and review process to then either confirm or ask for more information to confirm the identification that occurred.
Yeah, I mean, I know that in the Q&A you may get a couple of questions regarding how that works in more detail, but um, how strict are you with these adjudicators? Because I'm trying to think about it in a positive light. I mean, I've just come back from a tour in Serbia, for example, and Serbia is very well known for the owls that roost there. And I've been working very, very closely over the last 14 years with the BirdLife Serbia organization and to a very lesser extent the tourism of Serbia to try and direct people, because once the word gets out, it's an amazing phenomenon, to direct people to a particular site that can handle people coming, and taking photos and stuff. But what we've been finding over the last few years, especially with the popularity gaining on the owls, is that people are going and tagging on eBird, for example, where other roosts are, which could lead to disturbance because those areas we cannot protect as well because they're very vulnerable to disturbance. Is that happening because in that particular region there isn't a adjudicator, someone checking these things, or is it because the sort of information or whatever rules that come from you are very basic and you leave it up to the various regions to implement what they think they should be doing? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, whenever there's a sensitive species, we of course want to be very cognizant of that and ensure that everyone is mindful of observing them and giving them space as needed. So, eBird encourages users to delay reporting species until the potential for disturbance has passed. In the context of nesting species, for example, waiting until after the nesting period to submit those reports to ensure that there's a delay and the time has passed to minimize the amount of disturbance that could occur. And along with that, in our eBird community guidelines, we also encourage all users to be mindful of and practice kind of local rules when they're out birding. And in many cases, if there's a very high traffic area that folks are concerned about, minimizing disturbance there could also be one of those general guidelines to practice.
Okay. Well, I think it's very good that we're having this conversation because I think that people need to understand that side of it as well. Because obviously the whole way that eBird has risen to being part of birding parlance and also birding life is brilliant. But I think that people need to also understand the other side of it, which is the side that we need to think about when it comes to conservation and protection. So thank you. Now, before we actually go, because we've been talking for a while now, it's gone fairly quickly. Do you know what your favourite species of bird is in the world?
I find that it changes here and there, but now I would have to say the California quail. Similar to you, I'm actually headed out to California very soon, and I am just missing hearing them in the mornings. So I am really excited to see them, and I think they're definitely up there as my favorite bird of the week.
Of the week? You change every week then, okay. And if you could be anywhere in the world, Emily, where would you be right now?
And that's also a really great question. I think right now I would love to be in coastal Georgia. Um, it's a little warmer than up here in Ithaca, but you can still do some great duck watching without being frigid.
Okay, excuse me. I just want to say to all those watching that there are plenty of in conservation whips to watch. Just trying to see if I can point to that yet. In conservation with. So please keep watching, and we also got one coming up on Thursday. This Thursday coming, with Ken Kaufman, the venerable Ken Kaufman, talking about his latest book. But anyway, Emily, thank you so much for sparing your time to explain the workings of eBird and of Merlin. And I hope that people watching this have learned a lot and will use your wonderful pieces of technology in the best way possible. So thank you very much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you all. And thank you, David.
And I also like to thank the Zoomers here today for coming along and supporting in conservation with. So until we all meet again, all I'd like to say now is keep looking up.